Marilyn Cooper sat by the window of her modest apartment, the pale morning sun casting long shadows across the living room floor. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she buttoned her cardigan, a habit she'd developed over the years to still her nerves. Her breathing was shallow, her chest ached, and a strange numbness radiated down her left arm. She had felt these symptoms before, fleeting, easy to ignore, but today they were louder, more insistent, and impossible to push aside. The walls around her seemed to press in as panic and confusion warred silently behind her calm, aged eyes. She glanced at the clock. 6:47 a.m. Daniel should be awake by now. For a moment, she hesitated, phone in hand, thumb hovering over her son's number. Her pride told her not to bother him. He was busy. He always said so, but her instinct, that mother's instinct that never quite faded, urged her to try. She tapped his name and brought the phone to her ear, listening to the endless ring until it went to voicemail. Daniel, it's Mom, she said softly. I think something's wrong. I don't feel right. Can you come by, or call me back, please? She hung up and sat still for a moment, the phone resting on her lap like a lead weight. No call back came. She tried again 10 minutes later, then again 15 minutes after that. Still nothing. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and collected, walking her through the symptoms and assuring her help was on the way. Within 15 minutes, an ambulance pulled up outside her building, and 2 paramedics helped her down the stairs. Marilyn winced with every step, not just from the physical pain, but from the hollow feeling of loneliness. She had raised a son. She had poured every ounce of her love, time, and strength into his life. Yet, in this critical moment, he wasn't here. Inside the ambulance, she lay on the stretcher with oxygen tubes in her nose and a blood pressure cuff around her arm. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Ruby, held her hand and spoke gently. You're going to be okay, ma'am. We're taking you to St. Vincent's. Do you have any family we can call? My son, she replied, her voice brittle. Daniel Cooper, but I don't think he'll pick up. Ruby gave her a small, compassionate nod and squeezed her hand. Well, I'll be here, okay? You're not alone right now. Marilyn blinked back tears, but the kindness in Ruby's voice was a balm she hadn't expected. Her breath was shaky, her chest still tight, but she felt momentarily safe. The emergency room was cold and filled with beeping monitors, the clatter of wheels on tile, and hushed urgency. Doctors moved quickly, blood tests were drawn, and EKGs were conducted. Her heart had shown irregular rhythms, and Dr. Holloman, in his early 40s with kind eyes, spoke to her gently about the possibility of a minor cardiac event. You're lucky you called when you did, he said, looking at her chart. But I'm more concerned about your medical history. There are signs we should have caught earlier. You've been ignoring this, haven't you? Marilyn nodded sheepishly. I didn't want to be a burden. Dr. Hale shook his head. You're not a burden. Ignoring your health only makes things harder later. We'll run more tests and monitor you closely. Do you have any family we can update? My son, she repeated, but he hasn't come. Throughout the day, Marilyn waited. The phone on her bedside table remained silent. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and offering small smiles. Ruby stopped by during her break and brought her a warm blanket and some crackers. She talked with her for a few minutes, asking about her life, where she was from, what she used to do. Marilyn found herself speaking of the past, her teaching days, Daniel's school years, her husband James, who passed away a decade ago. Ruby listened intently, and it was that act of being heard, of being seen, that unraveled the knot in Marilyn's chest more than any medicine could. But as daylight waned into dusk, her hope dwindled. She kept staring at the hospital door, imagining Daniel rushing in, apologizing, saying he was busy but he was here now. She imagined him holding her hand and bringing her favorite blanket from home. But reality was colder than the imagined comfort. There was no call, no message, no visit. When she finally mustered the strength to check her phone, there was only one text. It was from Daniel, 3 hours late, and it read, "Hope you're okay. Swamped with meetings. We'll check in tomorrow." A tear slipped down Marilyn's cheek. She wasn't surprised, just hurt in that quiet way only a mother can be when forgotten by her child. She set the phone aside and looked at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights humming softly above her. She wasn't angry yet. She wasn't ready for anger, What she felt now was sadness, an ocean of it. Asterisk later that night, Dr. Hale came in again with a clipboard in his hand. "We need to keep you here for observation," he said gently. "There are some abnormalities in your blood work. I'd like to refer you to oncology for further screening. It could be nothing, but I'd rather not take chances." Asterisk Marilyn met his gaze. "Cancer," she whispered. Asterisk, "It's too early to say," he said carefully, "but we want to be sure." Asterisk she nodded slowly. "And my son?" Asterisk, "I understand," he said, "but for now, let's focus on you. We'll schedule the tests first thing in the morning." Asterisk when he left, Marilyn stared out the small window at the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The ache in her chest no longer came only from illness, it came from realization. For years, she had excused Daniel's behavior. His distance, his coldness, his wife Linda's thinly veiled contempt during dinners. The way they spoke to her, like an obligation. She had told herself they were just busy, just adjusting, just stressed. But now, with the harsh clarity that only hospital walls could bring, she saw the truth. She had raised a son who saw her as a weight to carry, not a woman to cherish. Asterisk the next morning, Ruby returned during the start of her shift. "Any word from your son?" she asked gently, placing a glass of water by her bedside. Asterisk no, Marilyn replied, "but thank you for checking." Asterisk Ruby hesitated. "Can I tell you something, Marilyn?" She nodded. "My grandma raised me after my mom left. When she was sick, I didn't leave her side. I slept on the hospital chair next to her, held her hand through every chemo session. I couldn't imagine being anywhere else. You deserve that, too. You're not invisible. You matter." Asterisk, those words were like a spark in Marilyn's soul. After Ruby left, she sat up slowly, legs dangling over the bed. She asked for her purse, took out a notepad she always carried, and began to write. It wasn't a letter. Not yet. It was a list. A list of things she would no longer ignore. A list of people she had loved and lost. A list of truths she could no longer deny. Asterisk, she didn't know yet that her diagnosis would come back positive. She didn't know that Daniel would never show up even after her test results arrived. She didn't know that she would rewrite her will and surprise everyone. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. Asterisk, she was no longer just a patient. In room 208, she was a woman, reclaiming her worth. Asterisk, she would heal. Not just her body, but her heart. Not for Daniel. Not for apologies that would never come. But for herself, for the life she still had and the dignity she still carried. Asterisk, and it all began with that lonely ride to the hospital, when her son didn't show up, when silence became the answer she could no longer ignore. Asterisk, the hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the monitor tracking Marilyn's heart rate. The sun filtered weakly through the frosted window, casting long shadows on the sterile floor. Morning rounds had passed, and the doctors had already delivered the news. Her biopsy had returned with results. The diagnosis was early-stage lymphoma. Treatable, they said, with a good prognosis if she began chemotherapy promptly. But it wasn't the word cancer that stung the most. It was the silence, the absence, the empty space on the visitor's chair next to her bed that spoke louder than any disease. Asterisk, Daniel hadn't called. He hadn't come. Not even a brief message asking how she was feeling after the tests. Marilyn clutched the phone in her hand, staring at the screen like it was a relic from a forgotten life. Her hands were lined with years of love, labor, and sacrificed years, spent raising him, defending him, forgiving him. Yet now, in this vulnerable moment, those years felt like dust slipping between her fingers. Asterisk, the nurse, Ruby, entered the room. With her usual soft smile, she placed a fresh blanket at the foot of the bed and adjusted Marilyn's fur gently. Asterisk, "I'm so sorry, Marilyn," Ruby said, her voice sincere. "I saw your chart, but early stage is good news. As far as cancer goes," asterisk Marilyn offered a weak smile. "Thank you, dear. I suppose I should feel lucky." Asterisk, "You don't have to feel anything. You're not ready to," Ruby replied. "This is still hard." Asterisk, "It's strange," Marilyn murmured. "You spend your life being the strong one. Then one day, you realize no one remembers that strength. Not even your own child." Asterisk Ruby sat on the edge of the bed. "People can be so disappointing, but that doesn't mean you stop being who you are." Asterisk Marilyn nodded slowly, then looked away. Ruby patted her hand and left quietly, understanding that no words could patch the hole that Daniel's absence had carved into her soul. Asterisk the next morning, the oncology specialist visited her room to explain the treatment plan. Chemotherapy would begin the following week, administered once every 3 weeks, for 6 cycles. Side effects were expected: fatigue, nausea, hair loss, but there was reason to hope. They discussed insurance, scheduling, and post-treatment checkups. When asked about emergency contact information, Marilyn hesitated. She almost gave Daniel's number, but her voice caught in her throat. Asterisk no one, she finally said. I'll manage alone. Asterisk that small declaration tasted bitter in her mouth. It wasn't entirely true. Ruby had become an unexpected support, and Dr. Hale had been kind, but none of them were Daniel. None of them could replace the bond she had once dreamed would strengthen, not break, with time. Asterisk that evening, Marilyn received a message from Linda, Daniel's wife. It was short, cold, and carefully devoid of warmth. Asterisk, hope you're recovering. Daniel's been under a lot of stress at work. We'll try to stop by sometime next week if things settle down. Asterisk no apology, no questions, no concern, just a perfunctory message that served more as an excuse than an attempt at connection. Asterisk Marilyn read the message again, her eyes filling with tears. She could picture Linda immaculate as ever, sitting on their pristine leather couch, tapping the message with one manicured finger while Daniel scrolled through emails, too busy to look up. Marilyn had always sensed that Linda disapproved of her. She was too ordinary, too quiet, too poor in her retirement to fit into their polished lives. Visits had become formalities over the years, often revolving around holidays or birthdays, always ending early and feeling emotionally distant. Asterisk but even Marilyn had never expected this level of abandonment. Asterisk she opened the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out a small, weathered photo album she had brought from home. Inside were pictures of Daniel as a baby, a toddler, a teen, his first haircut, his graduation, his wedding, where she had sat at the back table while Linda's parents gave speeches and basked in the limelight. Marilyn had smiled through it all, telling herself that she was being too sensitive, that he loved her, even if he couldn't show it the way she hoped. Asterisk she stopped at a photo of Daniel, age 7, holding a handmade card that said "Best Mom Ever" in crooked letters. Her thumb brushed over the edges of the card in the photo. That boy had once loved her with his whole heart. Where had that boy gone? Asterisk the following day, Marilyn asked for access to the hospital's public computer system. She logged in to check her bank accounts, review her will, and read through documents she hadn't touched in years. Her eyes settled on the legal file labeled estate. It detailed her modest assets, her pension, savings, the apartment she owned, a small cottage upstate left to her by her late husband James. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to be considered valuable. Asterisk she stared at the document, her heart pounding. For years, she had planned to leave everything to Daniel. She had believed that passing on her legacy, her home, would be a final act of love, a way to remind him that no matter what, she had always stood by him. Asterisk, but now she wondered, had he ever truly stood by her? Asterisk a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Hale. Asterisk may I? He asked, stepping in. Of course, Marilyn replied, closing the folder on the screen. I just wanted to check in. I know this isn't easy, but I think you're handling it with incredible grace. Asterisk she smiled faintly. I'm not sure grace is the word, maybe numbness. Asterisk he sat beside her. It's not uncommon for patients to reevaluate things during this kind of news. Their families, their plans, their priorities. Asterisk, I've been doing just that, she said, her voice steady. It's enlightening. Asterisk, Dr. Hale nodded. Sometimes pain gives us clarity. Asterisk that night, Marilyn couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of the years she had lost trying to hold on to a version of her son that no longer existed. She thought of how she had made excuses for his coldness, how she had tried to see the best in every neglectful act. And now, as she faced one of the most frightening battles of her life, she had to accept the harshest truth. She mattered less to him than his career meetings. Asterisk in the early hours of the morning, she began writing a letter, not to Daniel, not yet, but to her lawyer, Benjamin Carter. Asterisk she outlined the changes she wanted to make to her will. She requested that her assets be donated to a charity for elderly patients and single mothers. She also mentioned Ruby by name, requesting a scholarship be created in her honor for compassionate nursing students. Lastly, she asked that her upstate cottage be transferred to Eliza Raya Bright, young woman she had mentored during her years as a teacher, who was now struggling to pay for graduate school. Asterisk, each word felt like a release. With every sentence, Marilyn reclaimed a piece of herself. She no longer felt tethered to the fantasy of being someone's cherished mother. She was a woman who had given everything and now had the right to choose who was worthy of what remained. Asterisk, as dawn broke, the sky tinged pink with the promise of a new day. Marilyn sealed the letter and placed it in her overnight bag. She knew there would be fallout. Daniel would be furious when he eventually learned he had been excluded. Linda would sneer and call her petty. But neither of them had sat beside her when the diagnosis was given. Neither of them had held her hand in the dark hours. Neither had proven their love when it was needed the most. Asterisk, she had made her decision, not out of vengeance, but out of justice. And for the first time in many years, Marilyn felt peace. The silence that had once screamed betrayal now spoke of resilience. She wasn't broken. She wasn't forgotten. She was choosing to be remembered on her own terms. Marilyn awoke to the soft hum of morning in the hospital, her body stiff from another night of restless sleep and her mind lingering somewhere between numbness and clarity. The nurse had already changed her IV bag, and a tray of bland hospital breakfast sat untouched on the tray beside her. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't even tired anymore. She felt something else's slow-burning determination, a reckoning that was no longer postponed by hope or softened by denial. She had faced her diagnosis. She had faced the void where her son should have stood, and now she would face the truth without flinching. Asterisk, her thoughts drifted again to Daniel, not the man he was now, stern, corporate, and absent, but the boy who used to sneak into her bed during thunderstorms, wrapping his little arms around her and whispering, "Don't worry, Mama, I'll protect you." That boy, the one with the crooked smile and scraped knees, had loved her fiercely. But somewhere along the way, the world had turned him into someone else, someone colder, someone who saw her as an obligation rather than a mother. It wasn't just the abandonment in the hospital that hurt, it was the long series of quiet betrayals that had led to this moment. Asterisk, mid-morning, lawyer Benjamin Carter arrived. He was a tall man in his 60s with a calm demeanor and a precise way of speaking. She had called him the night before and asked him to meet her at the hospital to discuss urgent changes to her will. Asterisk, Benjamin took a seat beside her and opened his leather briefcase, removing a folder and a pen. "You sounded certain over the phone," he said. "Are you sure you want to proceed with these revisions?" Asterisk, "I've never been more certain of anything," Marilyn replied, her voice low but unwavering. "I've spent too much of my life believing that love was automatic, that family was sacred, no matter how poorly it treated you. But now, I see things clearly." Asterisk, Benjamin nodded. "We'll make it official. I have the updated documents with me. Once you sign them, I'll have them notarized and filed within the day." Asterisk, Marilyn looked over the pages he handed her. Her estate was modest, her apartment in Queens, a retirement savings fund, her pension, and the cottage James had left her in Vermont. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to change a life. Enough to provide comfort and security. Daniel had always assumed it would all be his, but assumptions were privileges, and he had forfeited that right the moment he left her to face illness alone. Asterisk, as she signed the new will, she felt the finality of each stroke of the pen. She designated her apartment to a local women's shelter, her savings to be split between a cancer research organization and a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Ruby's name was on the list, $15,000 earmarked to support her continued nursing education, and Eliza Ray, her former student, was to receive the Vermont cottage and a letter explaining why. Asterisk, when Benjamin collected the signed documents and sealed them in his folder, he gave her a thoughtful look. "This isn't easy. Marilyn, I've handled estate transitions for decades. It's always hardest when it involves family. Are you prepared for the reaction?" Asterisk, "I'm not doing this for revenge," she said softly. "I'm doing it because I deserve better. I'm doing it because someone has to remind Daniel that love is earned. It's not a reward for indifference." Asterisk, Benjamin stood and gently patted her shoulder. "You're a remarkable woman, Marilyn. I hope someday he understands that." Asterisk, after he left, Marilyn sat alone again, but the loneliness didn't feel quite so sharp. She had taken back a piece of her voice, and that was something no hospital walls could contain. Asterisk, later that afternoon, Daniel finally called. Asterisk, her phone buzzed beside her, and her heart skipped despite herself. For a moment, she stared at the screen, torn between answering and letting it ring, but something deeper urged her to face it, to confront the man her son had become. Hello, Daniel, she said calmly as she answered. Mom, came his voice, tight and impatient. I just saw your messages. What's going on? You're in the hospital. I've been here for 3 days, she replied, not raising her voice. They found lymphoma, earliest stage, but it's serious. There was a pause. Then, lymphoma. Are you getting treatment? Yes. Chemotherapy starts next week. Another pause. I didn't realize it was that serious. You would have, if you had answered the phone. His silence on the other end said everything. Marilyn waited, giving him the space to say something meaningful, something kind, something worthy. But what came instead was clinical concern. Do you need me to arrange anything? A private hospital? A home nurse? I can cover the costs if you want something more comfortable. She blinked. I don't need your money, Daniel. I needed you to show up. He sighed. Mom, I'm under so much pressure right now. Linda's father is retiring, and there's talk of me taking over the company. It's been chaos. I was diagnosed with cancer, she interrupted, her voice quiet but sharp. And you're talking about promotions. There was a longer pause this time. I didn't mean to neglect you, he said, but the words sounded hollow, like something rehearsed. But you did. Another silence. I'll come by tomorrow, he said finally. We'll talk properly. No need, she said. I've already spoken to Benjamin. The paperwork is done. What paperwork? My will. She didn't elaborate. Let him sit with the weight of that sentence. Let him wonder. Mom, he said, voice tense. Don't do anything rash. I was going to come. You didn't. I was going to, but you didn't. And then, she ended the call. She sat for a long while, eyes closed, breathing deeply. She didn't cry. She didn't even feel angry anymore. She felt free. The next day Ruby returned with a small bouquet of daisies and a cup of homemade soup in a thermos. She was off duty, but had stopped by because she wanted to. I thought you could use something warm, she said. Marilyn's eyes watered. Not because of the soup, but because of the gesture. You're too kind. Ruby smiled. Kindness is easy when you care. They sat together, eating and talking, the room filled with the kind of soft companionship that Marilyn had longed for. Not obligation, not duty, just presence, just heart. Later that evening, Marilyn wrote a letter to Eliza, explaining the cottage and what it meant. She described the way James had built it with his own hands, how the windows caught the sunrise over the lake, how the attic always smelled of cedar and old books. She wrote about how Eliza had reminded her of herself, curious, gentle, strong despite the world trying to prove otherwise. She ended the letter with a sentence that came straight from the soul. Use this gift to rest when you're tired, to dream when you're brave, and to remember that someone believed in you. It was more than Daniel would ever get from her again. The following morning, the first round of chemotherapy began. Marilyn sat in the treatment chair with a warm blanket over her knees and Ruby by her side. The nurse adjusted the floor, and the medicine flowed slowly into her veins. She looked out the window at the city below, its noise and chaos, its speed and forgetfulness, and she smiled. She had not been forgotten. Not by everyone, not by herself. And as the medicine worked its quiet alchemy inside her, Marilyn Cooper felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not regret, not sorrow, but peace. Pure, earned, liberating peace. Because the silence that had screamed betrayal no longer haunted her. It had become a mirror, one she had faced, shattered, and walked beyond. And with each drop of chemotherapy, she wasn't just healing her body, she was rewriting the story of her life. One where she wasn't left behind. But one where she chose to walk ahead alone. Yes, but finally, truly, whole. The hospital had become a second home to Marilyn Cooper over the past few weeks. Its hallways familiar now, its staff more comforting than the echoes of her own apartment. Chemotherapy had begun one long, cold drip at a time, and, though the side effects were brutal, Marilyn bore them with quiet strength. The nausea was persistent. Her appetite fled almost entirely, and she spent entire nights awake, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows dance across the sterile walls. Her gray hair had begun to thin in clumps. Her hands trembled more often, and her skin had lost its flush. But something else within her had changed. An anchor had dropped deep inside her, a resolve that refused to be shaken. Ruby continued to visit even on her off days, and the comfort she provided was more powerful than any prescription. She brought homemade food, crossword puzzles, and at one point even a small, second-hand record player with a collection of old jazz vinyls. The music filled Marilyn's room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. There was no pity in Ruby's care, only kindness, a rare kind that asked for nothing in return. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Marilyn sat by the window wrapped in a wool shawl, a hot water bottle nestled against her lap. She stared down at the people bustling across the city streets, all with their destinations and dramas, unaware of the woman 6 floors above them, choosing to rewrite her legacy, one breath at a time. She thought again of Daniel, where he was, what he was doing, and whether she ever truly knew him. After their tense phone call, he hadn't followed up. No visit. No further messages, just silence. Once again, Marilyn had accepted that silence now, not as something to mourn, but something to move past. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered by a hospital administrator, a man in a navy suit, who looked far too formal for the hospice floor. He gave it to her without a word and left. The envelope was sleek, embossed with a logo she didn't recognize. Inside, the letter was printed on thick paper. It was from Daniel. Mother. It began formal, distant, as if she were a client rather than the woman who had raised him. I regret the tone of our last conversation. I was caught off guard and frustrated. After speaking with Linda and consulting our legal team, I felt it necessary to clarify our concerns regarding the changes you've made to your estate. Marilyn's hands froze. Her eyes scanned the letter, bile rising in her throat. We understand your right to alter your will, but we believe it is the product of emotional duress, possibly influenced by external parties without legal oversight. I respectfully request you reconsider your decisions and meet with our family attorney to ensure fairness and avoid future conflict. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of her illness, no question of her well-being. It wasn't even a plaque. It was a veiled threat, a challenge. The suggestion that she, a woman fighting cancer alone, was incapable of making choices without someone manipulating her. Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. Anger stirred deep inside her, but it wasn't wild or uncontrollable. It was quiet, focused, cold, the kind of anger that doesn't scream, it moves, it decides, it acts. That evening, Benjamin visited again, and she showed him the letter. He read it without surprise and placed it back on the table. They're preparing for a contestation, he said. They think you're weak, that you'll back down. I won't, Marilyn replied. I believe you, he said. She leaned forward. Can we make it even harder for them? Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Legally, yes. I can record a video statement verifying your mental clarity. We can include dated physician reports confirming you're of sound mind. If they try to dispute it, we'll bury them in documentation. Do it. Benjamin smiled. That's the Marilyn I remember from our first case together. Marilyn laughed, though her ribs ached when she did. Back then, I was fighting for my students. I guess now, I'm fighting for myself. You're still fighting for someone, he said gently, just not who they expected. After he left, she spent hours going through old photographs and journals on her phone and in a box Ruby had brought from her apartment. Memories flooded in: James holding her hand under a spring rain, Daniel's 5th birthday party when the cake collapsed in the car and they laughed about it for days, her old classroom filled with eager faces, some of whom now sent her letters each year. She realized something as she sorted through the pieces of her past. She had been deeply loved, maybe not by Daniel anymore, but by James, by her students, by friends like Nina and Eliza, and even by new souls like Ruby. Her life had been rich, full of giving. Daniel's absence couldn't erase that. The next morning, she recorded the video Benjamin suggested. She sat upright in the chair, hair wrapped in a scarf, eyes alert, and voice strong. My name is Marilyn Cooper. I am of sound mind and body. I have chosen to update my will, not out of coercion, but clarity. The beneficiaries of my estate are people and causes I believe in. those who stood with me when I was at my most vulnerable. My decisions are final, and I stand by them with peace in my heart. Asterisk, after the recording, Benjamin nodded. They won't touch this. Asterisk, Marilyn felt lighter, not because she had won a fight, but because she had nothing left to hide. She had lived a full life, and now she was taking charge of how it would end. Asterisk, the following week, the second round of chemotherapy hit harder. Her immune system was weakened, and the nausea left her bedridden. Her skin turned pale, her joints ached, and some days she barely had the strength to lift her head. But Ruby was there, always there. And when she couldn't speak, Ruby would simply sit beside her, reading aloud or playing old Ella Fitzgerald records to soothe her. Asterisk, one afternoon, while Marilyn drifted in and out of sleep, she heard a voice outside her room, loud, familiar. Asterisk, I'm his son, the voice said. I don't need permission to see her. It was Daniel. She opened her eyes and saw him standing awkwardly by the door, phone in hand, suit still immaculate. He looked out of place in the pale, quiet room. She said nothing, just stared. Asterisk, he stepped in slowly. I came to check on you. Asterisk, she raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks late. Asterisk, he exhaled. I got your lawyer's reply. I just... I don't understand why you're doing this. Why you'd give everything away to strangers. Asterisk, they're not strangers, she said, her voice weak but firm. They're people who showed up. Asterisk, I'm your son. Asterisk, are you? She asked. Because you feel like a stranger to me now. Asterisk, Daniel's face twisted. This is ridiculous. You're punishing me because I was late to a hospital visit. Asterisk, no, she said. I'm reminding you that love doesn't come with guarantees. And it certainly doesn't come with a check. Asterisk, Daniel stared at her, mouth half open, as if grasping for a defense. Asterisk, I raised you, she said, tears gathering in her eyes but refusing to fall. I protected you. I forgave you when you forgot birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. I defended you when Linda sneered at me for being too ordinary. I told myself you were just busy, that one day you'd realize I still mattered. But now I see that I was the only one holding on. Asterisk, he looked away. And for a moment, Marilyn saw the boy he once was, confused, ashamed, silent. Asterisk, I'm not angry, she added quietly. I'm free. Asterisk. And with that, she closed her eyes, signaling the conversation was over. Asterisk, Daniel stood for a moment longer, then turned and left. No goodbyes, no apologies. Asterisk, Marilyn didn't cry after he left. She didn't break. She simply reached for the small journal Ruby had gifted her and wrote down a single sentence. The silence that once hurt me now protects me. That night, Ruby found her asleep, a soft smile on her lips. The record player spun slowly in the corner, and Ella Fitzgerald's voice drifted into the room like a lullaby. Asterisk, at last, my love has come along. Asterisk, Marilyn slept soundly because she had finally stopped waiting. She had faced her pain, told her truth, and reclaimed her story. The past no longer haunted her, and the future. It belonged to the people who chose to love her when it mattered. Asterisk, the days after Daniel's visit passed slowly, like autumn leaves drifting toward the earth, graceful and final. Marilyn's hospital room, once filled with uncertainty and longing, now held an aura of quiet resolution. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared, her body still ached from the chemotherapy. Her appetite was poor, and her hair had thinned almost completely, but there was peace, not the kind one stumbles into by accident, but the kind earned through grief, honesty, and hard choices. Asterisk, Marilyn spent her mornings by the window wrapped in her favorite shawl, a faded knitted piece James had bought her during their honeymoon decades ago. It still smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, a scent that comforted her more than any medication. She no longer waited for Daniel to call or come again. That door had closed with such certainty that there was no more room for hoping, and, strangely, that made her stronger. Asterisk, Ruby continued to visit without fail. Sometimes she brought flowers, sometimes music, sometimes just herself and a warm smile that didn't need words. They spoke about simple things, recipes, memories from childhood, favorite books, and sometimes about difficult things like death, family, and regret. Ruby never offered platitudes. She listened, she laughed when it was needed, and she let silence speak when that was all Marilyn wanted. Asterisk, one chilly afternoon, Marilyn was wheeled to the rooftop garden by an orderly named Sam. The staff had rigged up a temporary greenhouse on the roof for patients who needed sun and sky during long stays, wrapped in 2 blankets. Marilyn breathed in the crisp November air and tilted her face toward the pale sun. She was surprised to see Eliza Ray standing at the far end of the garden, nervously clutching a red scarf. Marilyn's heart warmed at the sight. Eliza, she called out, her voice dry but excited. Eliza turned, smiled, and quickly walked over. She looked older than the last time Marilyn had seen her. Her once untamed curls were tied back neatly, her eyes a little more tired, but her presence still carried the same spark. Marilyn remembered from the classroom years ago. I got your letter, Eliza said softly, sitting beside her. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. You didn't have to say anything, Marilyn replied. I just wanted you to know. Tears sprang into Eliza's eyes. You gave me a home, a real one, when I couldn't even afford a room in the city anymore. I've been working 2 jobs trying to keep up with tuition, and then your letter came. The cottage, the gift, the words. I cried the whole night. You were always meant for something great, Marilyn said, taking her hand. Sometimes people just need a place to rest so they can rise again. Eliza nodded, wiping her cheeks. I brought photos of the cottage. I went last weekend to see it. She opened her phone and scrolled through a gallery of warm, amber-toned pictures, sunlight streaming through the old windows, the fireplace still intact, the attic filled with forgotten books, the view of the lake just as breathtaking as Marilyn remembered. It's still exactly as you described, Eliza whispered. It's perfect. Marilyn smiled through her own tears. Then, it's where you're meant to be. They sat for a while in silence, the weight of gratitude and goodbye, unspoken but deeply understood. Before leaving, Eliza pressed something into Marilyn's hand, a tiny crocheted dove. I made it after I read your letter, she said. I thought you'd like it. I do, Marilyn replied. More than you know. Back in her room, Marilyn placed the dove beside her bed, where she could see it each morning. It became a symbol not of endings, but of everything she had poured into the world that was coming back to her. One kind soul at a time. The next day, Benjamin returned with updated legal documents. The scholarship fund in Marilyn's name had officially been approved. It would support nursing students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and Ruby would be the inaugural recipient. Marilyn cried when she read the confirmation. I don't have children who stood by me, she told Benjamin, but I have made daughters in kindness, sons in generosity. That matters more than blood. Benjamin simply nodded. I've never seen someone face the end with such clarity. I'm not at the end, she said with a smile. I'm at the middle of something new. Later that evening, Ruby entered the room after her shift. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and she looked exhausted. But her eyes lit up when Marilyn held out the scholarship letter. You're the first recipient, Marilyn said, beaming. You'll go back to school next spring. Ruby was speechless. Her hands trembled as she read the document, and when she finished, she covered her mouth and shook her head. I can't accept this, she whispered. You can, Marilyn insisted. You must. You cared for me when no one else did. Should count for something in this world. Ruby sat beside her and leaned her head on Marilyn's shoulder. It already does. But thank you. They sat that way for a long time, saying nothing, letting the hum of machines and the world beyond the hospital walls fade into the background. 2 days later, Linda came to the hospital unannounced. Her appearance was as perfectly curated as always, long beige coat, designer handbag, flawless makeup. She knocked once and stepped in without waiting. Marilyn looked up from her book. Linda, Marilyn, she said curtly. You look, well, you don't have to lie. Linda smiled coldly and sat in the chair Daniel had once promised to occupy. I'm not here to argue. I just wanted to see if there's any chance you might reconsider. No. Linda pursed her lips. Daniel has worked very hard. He expected I'm not responsible for what he expected, Marilyn interrupted. I gave him my life. That was enough. Linda crossed her legs. And you think giving everything away to people like that nurse, her name is Ruby. Right, Ruby, you think she deserves what Daniel built with you? Marilyn's eyes narrowed. What did Daniel build with me? He didn't build this hospital bed. He didn't build a relationship. He didn't build the strength it took to fight through cancer without him. You don't get to question my legacy just because you covet it. Asterisk Linda looked momentarily thrown. You're bitter. Asterisk no, Marilyn said calmly. I'm awake. Asterisk for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Linda rose. Asterisk then, I suppose there's nothing more to say. Asterisk there never was. Asterisk when she left. Marilyn exhaled deeply, feeling the last tendrils of old guilt float away. She hadn't just spoken for herself, she had spoken for every woman who had ever been silenced by duty, guilt, or family expectation. Asterisk that night, she asked Ruby to bring her something personal from her apartment. Boffed at the top of the wardrobe, taped and labeled James. Ruby returned the next morning, box in hand. Asterisk inside were letters, dozens of them written by James to Marilyn over their 30-year marriage. Some were short notes left on her nightstand. Others were long, handwritten letters from his business trips. Each one carried affection, humor, gratitude. Marilyn read through them slowly, some aloud to Ruby, some in silence. I forgot how much he loved me, she whispered. You didn't forget, Ruby said. You just stopped hearing it in the noise. Asterisk one letter stood out among the rest, dated 2 months before his sudden death. It read, Asterisk if ever the world forgets your worth, let this be your reminder. You were my beginning, my middle, and my best ending. You deserved more poems. You deserved more years. But if I run out of time, promise me one thing, never give your light to those who never bothered to see it. Asterisk Marilyn wept, the kind of tears that wash, not drown. She clutched the letter to her chest and felt James with her, like a whisper in the bones, a breath beside her ear. Asterisk the days that followed weren't easy. Her treatments continued, and there were nights when pain stole her sleep and weakness clouded her thoughts. But she was never alone. Eliza called from Vermont every weekend. Ruby was ever present. Benjamin sent updates. Even Sam, the orderly, brought her coffee and jokes. Asterisk Marilyn began writing her memoirs on a donated tablet, short vignettes of teaching, motherhood, love, loss, and becoming herself again. Each word was a thread weaving the tapestry of a life that had once bent, but never broken. Asterisk she titled the draft, The Silence That Saved Me. Asterisk and when the first winter snow fell against the hospital window, Marilyn sat upright in bed, dove in hand, letter by her heart, and smiled. Because she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was heard. She was whole. She was home. Asterisk, the first snow of the season blanketed the city in a soft hush that muffled even the busiest streets below the hospital. From her window, Marilyn watched it fall like pieces of memory, delicate and fleeting. There was something about snow that always brought her back to James. He had loved winter, the quiet of it, the way it slowed the world down. She remembered their first Christmas in the Vermont cottage, how they had cooked soup over the fire and danced barefoot in wool socks on creaky wooden floors. Those were the moments that now returned to her, not as pain, but as quiet anchors of who she had been and still was beneath the layers of illness and abandonment. Asterisk, Marilyn's single quotes as chemotherapy was taking its toll. The side effects were harsher. This round her immune system was faltering, and every limb felt like it carried lead. Some mornings, she could barely lift a spoon, her body betraying the sharpness of her mind. Still, she endured. She marked each treatment completed with a small star on the notebook Ruby had given her, turning pain into progress, weakness into triumphs. She had survived worse in her life. Loneliness, heartbreak, grief, cancer, though cruel, would not define her. Asterisk one day, while Ruby was adjusting her pillow and humming a soft tune, Marilyn turned her head and whispered, "Do you believe we come back?" Asterisk Ruby paused, surprised by the question. "You mean reincarnation?" Asterisk no, Marilyn said with a faint smile. "I mean, do you think we come back to the people we've touched? Do pieces of us live in others?" Asterisk Ruby sat beside her and thought for a moment. "I think, when someone loves us deeply, they carry our voice, our gestures, our stories, even after we're gone." Asterisk then, "I think I'll come back in you," Marilyn whispered. "In your kindness, in your stubbornness, in your refusal to turn away." Asterisk tears welled up in Ruby's eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're not going anywhere yet, Marilyn. There's still too much of you left to give." Asterisk Marilyn nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Just in case, promise me something." Asterisk anything. Asterisk when it's time. Don't let them turn my life into a legal battle. Not Daniel. Not Linda. I want my story to end the way I've written it. Asterisk. Ruby held her hand firmly. I promise. I'll protect it. Asterisk. It was a quiet, sacred moment between two women who had started as nurse and patient but had grown into something far deeper. Chosen family. The kind you don't inherit, but find in the shadows of life. Asterisk. A few days later, the hospital hosted a small winter recital for long-term patients. A string quartet from a nearby college played in the common lounge, filling the air with gentle, aching melodies. Marilyn had been wheeled in by Sam, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes lighting up at the sound of violins. The music transported her, each note unraveled memories, James tracing her collarbone as music played in the background. Daniel, as a child, dancing in the living room to old records. Laughter echoing between walls, now quiet. Asterisk. Across the room, Marilyn noticed a woman she hadn't seen before. She sat alone, thin and pale, her face drawn by something far deeper than illness. Marilyn leaned slightly toward Ruby, who stood nearby. Asterisk. Who's that? Asterisk. Ruby followed her gaze. Her name's Ingrid, stage for lung cancer. Doesn't have any family, far as we know. Asterisk. Marilyn's heart ached. That kind of aloneness had a particular silence, one she had once feared would consume her to. Asterisk. Can we invite her over? Marilyn asked. Asterisk. With a nod. Ruby approached Ingrid and whispered gently to her. Ingrid hesitated but slowly stood and walked across the room, guided by her forepole. She sat beside Marilyn, her eyes wary. Asterisk. I'm Marilyn. Asterisk. Ingrid. They shook hands gently, as if the gesture itself was fragile. The music's lovely, Marilyn said. Asterisk. It is, Ingrid replied. I used to play violin, years ago. Asterisk. You still could. Asterisk. Ingrid gave a soft laugh. My fingers are too stiff now, and my lungs won't let me hold a bow long enough. Asterisk. You could teach someone, Marilyn said with a smile. Your hands might be tired, but your story isn't. Asterisk. Ingrid blinked, and for a moment, her expression cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of emotion buried beneath exhaustion. Asterisk. They sat quietly after that, listening. When the recital ended, Ingrid squeezed Marilyn's hand. Asterisk. Thank you. I haven't spoken to anyone in days. Asterisk. You're not invisible here, Marilyn said softly. Not while I'm around. Asterisk. It became a ritual. Every afternoon, Ingrid joined Marilyn in her room, and they talked about their lives, regrets, old books, and the things they wished they had done. Ingrid had never married, had no children, but had once loved a woman in secret for over 20 years. The world wasn't kind back then, she said. So I hid everything I was. I've spent the last decade wondering if I disappeared before I even died. Asterisk. You didn't, Marilyn said. You're here. You matter. You're seen. Asterisk. In giving Ingrid a sense of worth again, Marilyn found even more of her own. In comforting someone else's aloneness, she lightened her own. The room became a haven, where pain was shared but not pitied, where silence was restful, not lonely. Then, one night, Marilyn's fever spiked. Ruby rushed to her side, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, adjusting her oxygen, calling for the night doctor. Her body shook with chills. Her pulse raced. The chemo had weakened her to the point where even a common infection became a storm. Asterisk. Through blurred vision, Marilyn saw shapes. Ruby's worried face, the nurse adjusting her the doctor speaking in urgent tones. She couldn't respond, but she could hear them. Hear the panic. Asterisk. Somewhere between waking and unconsciousness, Marilyn felt herself drifting out of the bed, out of the pain, out of the hospital walls. There was no fear, just warmth, just light. She saw James again, not as a ghost, not as a vision, but as a feeling, a familiar embrace. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Asterisk. Then, Ruby's voice cut through the fog. Marilyn, stay with me, please. Please, please, stay. And something inside her obeyed. The fever broke by morning. Asterisk. She was weak, barely able to lift her head, but she was alive. The doctor told her she had made it through the worst, but it would be a long road back. Ruby stayed by her side all night, her eyes red from crying, her hand never letting go. Asterisk. When Marilyn opened her eyes, Ruby let out a shaky laugh. You scared me. Asterisk. I'm sorry, Marilyn whispered. I just needed to see the other side for a moment. Asterisk. You saw it. Asterisk. Yes, Marilyn said. But then I heard you, and I remembered my story's not done yet. Asterisk. Ingrid came by later, holding a thermos of warm broth. She sat quietly, her eyes glassy. Asterisk, you really thought you'd leave me alone again, didn't you? She teased. Asterisk, I changed my mind. Marilyn croaked. There's still so much more soup to drink. Asterisk, they all laughed. And for a moment, the hospital room felt like a living room, like a home, like something beautiful despite the grief. Asterisk later, Marilyn began writing again, this time, not just about her life, but about the lives she had touched. She wrote about Ruby, about Ingrid, about Eliza, and even about Benjamin. She wrote about the silence Daniel left behind, and how others filled it with music and care. Asterisk, one paragraph, scrawled near the bottom of a page, read, asterisk, sometimes we imagine legacy as what we leave behind in our will, but legacy isn't just what's written on paper, it's what we heal in others, what we awaken, what we save, simply by showing up. Asterisk, by the end of the week, Marilyn was sitting up again, her strength slowly returning. The doctors marveled at her recovery, but she knew it wasn't just medicine, it was connection, it was kindness, it was being seen and seeing others. Asterisk, the silence that had once screamed betrayal had been replaced with a quieter, stronger silence, one that hummed with the truth of lives reclaimed. Asterisk, Marilyn didn't know how many months she had left, maybe many, maybe few, but she had stopped measuring life in numbers. Asterisk, she now measured it in moments, and every one of them, from now on, would be hers. Asterisk, the world outside Marilyn's hospital room was slowly waking to spring. Though it was only early March, buds had begun to form on the trees lining the avenue below, and a golden hue touched the skyline every morning. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but to Marilyn, who had grown used to the sterile stillness of winter's grasp, it felt like a quiet revolution, a promise that something tender could survive even after so much had withered. Asterisk, Marilyn was stronger now. The latest rounds of chemotherapy had been less punishing, or perhaps she had grown more resilient. Her blood counts were slowly improving, her appetite returning in small but steady ways, and her laughter, which had once sounded thin and strained, now had warmth to it again. Even her doctor, Dr. Hale, noted her surprising vitality. You've turned a corner, he said one morning, reviewing her latest scans. It's early to say anything definitive, but your body is responding well. Asterisk, Marilyn smiled. Maybe it's the company I keep. Asterisk, indeed, her world had expanded in beautiful, unexpected ways. Ruby remained her daily support, never missing a visit. Ingrid, though battling her own decline, continued to join her for quiet chats and shared meals. Eliza wrote long letters every Sunday from the Vermont cottage, detailing her life among the trees, the books she was reading, and the peace she had finally found. Benjamin visited weekly to update her on the scholarship fund and brought stories of the students now applying to be part of the legacy Marilyn had built with her kindness. Asterisk, her room was no longer just a room. It was alive with photos taped to the walls, fresh flowers in jars, and a notebook filled with her writing on the bedside table. She had even been gifted a small bonsai tree by one of the scholarship applicants who had been touched by her story. She named it Echo because it reminded her that love, once planted, kept growing even in places she could no longer reach. Then, one day, Daniel returned. There was no announcement this time, no call ahead or formal letter. He simply appeared in the doorway one Thursday afternoon, wearing a dark coat and holding a small, untouched bouquet of lilies. His face was drawn, pale, and though his posture was still proud, there was something different in his eyes, something that wasn't quite shame but wasn't arrogance either. Asterisk, Marilyn looked up from her book, calmly met his gaze, and closed the cover. You came, she said flatly. He stepped inside. I didn't think you'd see me. Asterisk, I didn't expect to. Asterisk, he looked around the room, taking in the clutter of affection and memories, the photos, the bonsai, the stack of letters. It didn't resemble a dying woman's room, it looked like someone fully living. Asterisk, Daniel cleared his throat. Linda doesn't know I'm here. Asterisk, I'm not surprised. Asterisk, he walked closer, stopping just short of her bed. I've been thinking a lot lately, about what you said, about what I didn't say. Asterisk, Marilyn watched him carefully. And, asterisk, I was wrong. I was, detached. I've always justified it by saying I was busy, that I had responsibilities. But truthfully, I just didn't know how to face you. Asterisk, she tilted her head. Why? Asterisk, he sat in the visitor's chair, placing the flowers on the side table. Because I know I disappointed you, and it's easier to pretend everything is fine than to admit that I don't know how to love you the way you loved me. Asterisk, that admission hit Marilyn like a wind she hadn't braced for. Not because it was untrue, but because it was something she had always feared but never heard aloud. Asterisk, I never needed the same kind of love back, she said after a long pause. Just a fraction of it, a gesture, a visit, a call, something to tell me that I mattered. Asterisk, you did. You do, he said quickly. I just didn't know how to show it. And when you changed your will, I got angry, not because of the money, but because it forced me to realize how absent I'd been, how replaceable I made myself. Asterisk, Marilyn nodded slowly. You were absent, and for a long time, I excused it. I told myself you were stressed, successful, busy. But one day, I stopped lying for you. Asterisk, Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Is it too late? That depends, she said softly. On what? Asterisk, on what you're asking for, she said. If you've come for my money, it's too late. If you've come to ease your guilt, that's not mine to fix. But if you've come to sit beside your mother, not because you regret the past, but because you want to honor what's left, then no, it's not too late. Asterisk, Daniel exhaled and stared at the floor. I don't know how to start. You just did, she replied. The air between them shifted, still heavy with history, but no longer unbearable. He looked up at her again, and this time, his eyes didn't dart away. Asterisk, they spoke for a long time about her treatments, her writing, the scholarship, and even about Eliza. She told him about Ingrid and Ruby, and how they had shown up when he hadn't. She didn't sugarcoat the pain, and he didn't ask her to. Asterisk, at one point, he asked quietly, did you ever stop loving me? Asterisk, Marilyn looked out the window, watching the sunlight pour in over the rooftops. No, she said, but I stopped waiting for you to love me back. Asterisk, tears gathered in Daniel's eyes. Not dramatic ones, just quiet, honest sorrow. I want to do better, he said. Then be better, she answered. Not for me. For the people in your life you haven't noticed yet. Asterisk, he nodded and stood. Can I visit again? Asterisk, if you come as my son, not my solicitor, she said. Asterisk, I will. Asterisk, after he left, Ruby entered with a bowl of soup and a raised eyebrow. Well? Asterisk, Marilyn sighed. He came as a question, not yet an answer. Asterisk, but at least he came. Asterisk, yes, Marilyn nodded. And that's something. Asterisk, the days that followed saw Daniel visiting more frequently. He didn't always bring flowers. Sometimes he just sat quietly and listened. Sometimes they read her writing together, and he laughed in places she never expected. He asked about her childhood, her favorite books, and even brought an old record player to match that one Ruby had loaned her. Slowly, cautiously, the wounds between them stopped bleeding. They didn't heal completely, but they stopped hurting every time they spoke. Asterisk, one afternoon, Daniel entered the room holding a manila folder. Asterisk, I want to show you something, he said. Asterisk, inside was a printed draft of a proposal he was writing, a philanthropic initiative under his company's name, inspired by her scholarship fund. It aimed to support underrepresented youth in education and healthcare. He had titled it the Cooper Initiative. Asterisk, Marilyn's eyes welled up. This is good. It's because of you, he said. No, she corrected. It's because you finally saw. Asterisk, the next weekend, Marilyn invited Ruby and Ingrid to join her and Daniel for tea. They sat in a circle, the afternoon sun painting their faces in gold. Ingrid shared a story about her time in an underground music group, and Daniel listened with genuine interest. Ruby teased Daniel about his tie, and for once, he didn't bristle, he laughed. Asterisk, Marilyn watched the scene unfold with quiet joy. Her world, once small and crumbling, was full again, not because everyone had stayed, but because the right ones finally showed up. Asterisk, later that night, alone again with her notebook, Marilyn wrote, asterisk, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means recognizing the wound, tending to it, and deciding to walk anyway. I forgave him not because he asked, but because I needed space for joy. Asterisk, she closed the notebook and turned off the lamp, the room falling into a peaceful hush. Outside, spring crept closer with every passing breeze, and inside, Marilyn's heart opened just a little wider to the possibility of what remained. Asterisk, because even the late blooms still blossoms, even the wintered branch can bud again, and even the son who left could learn, at last, how to come home. The hospital no longer felt like a place of endings. Somewhere between Marilyn's diagnosis and the changing of the seasons, it had transformed into a sanctuary of reflection, growth, and unexpected beginnings. Her room, once sterile and dim, now carried the atmosphere of a lived-in home. There were books stacked neatly beside her bed, handwritten letters pinned to the corkboard, gifts from visitors nestled on the windowsill, and always a faint hint of lavender from her favorite oil diffuser. Marilyn herself had changed, though the toll of chemotherapy still lingered visible in the sallow tone of her skin, the deepened lines across her face, and the soft scarf covering her bald head. There was a new light in her eyes, not the reckless shine of youth, but the enduring fire of someone who had faced death, abandonment, and loss, and refused to be diminished by any of it. Each morning, she would wake to the sun creeping across her bed, open her notebook, and write a few lines. Some entries were stories, some were fragments, some were just feelings she couldn't say out loud. Her memoir, The Silence That Saved Me, was taking shape not as a neat chronology of events, but as a constellation of hard-won truths, quiet observations, and sacred connections. In those pages, she wasn't just leaving behind a legacy, she was writing her freedom. Daniel's visits had grown regular, if still tentative. He came without pretense now, no longer dressed in his stiff office suits but in jeans and sweaters. He often brought books, snacks she'd once loved, and even a few of her old belongings from home, her favorite teacup, her antique brooch, and the faded Polaroid album she thought she'd lost. Each gesture was small, but together they built something more meaningful than a single apology ever could. One afternoon, Daniel arrived with a surprise. He held up a paper bag and grinned awkwardly. "I baked." Marilyn raised a thin eyebrow. "You baked?" "Well, I helped Linda bake," he admitted, setting the bag on the table. "Okay, technically, she baked and I watched, but I chose the recipe." Points for honesty, she said, chuckling as she opened the bag and saw lemon shortbread cookies, her favorite, the kind she used to make when Daniel was a boy. She picked one up and took a small bite. "Tastes like childhood." Daniel's expression softened. "You used to pack these in my lunch boxes." "You used to trade them for gummy worms." They both laughed, and for a fleeting moment, the years between them collapsed. He reached out and gently touched her wrist. "I never said it, but I missed you." "You didn't miss me," Marilyn said, not unkindly. "You missed who you could have been with me." Daniel blinked and nodded slowly. "I'm trying to be him now." She patted his hand. "That's all I ask." But even as these bridges were mending, another storm was approaching. It started with a letter, not from Daniel or Linda but from Linda's father, Charles Whitman, the owner of the corporate firm where Daniel worked. The envelope bore a seal Marilyn didn't recognize, but the tone inside was unmistakable, patronizing, legalistic, and cold. The letter accused Marilyn of sullying the family's public image by spreading personal matters into potentially defamatory narratives, referencing her scholarship foundation and memoir, both of which had recently gained local press attention. Charles had apparently caught wind of her story being shared, how she had altered her will, donated her assets, and publicly spoken about abandonment by her son. None of it named Daniel or the Whitman name directly, but the implications were clear enough for Charles to act. The final paragraph warned of reputational consequences should she continue, and advised her to avoid further media involvement. Marilyn stared at the letter for a long time. Then, without a word, she tore it neatly down the middle and tossed it into the waste bin. Ruby, who had just arrived for her evening check-in, noticed the paper fragments. "Everything okay?" Marilyn's smile didn't waver. "The past just tried to threaten me. I let it know I'm not afraid anymore." The next day, she asked Benjamin to draft a public letter of her own, one that could be shared if anyone attempted to challenge her character or intentions. She didn't want a legal battle, but she wasn't going to be intimidated into silence either. Her story mattered. Her voice mattered. Benjamin, loyal as ever, drafted a sharp but graceful response that Marilyn approved with one change at the end. She added a line in her own handwriting. "You cannot shame a woman who has already survived her silence." As news of her scholarship foundation continued to circulate, more letters began arriving not legal ones but handwritten notes from nursing students, young women in shelters, and strangers who had read about her in community bulletins or word-of-mouth features. Some called her an angel, others simply wrote, "Thank you for reminding me I matter." One particularly moving letter came from a teenage girl named Maya, who had been rejected by her family for wanting to pursue education. I didn't think I was worth anything, Maya had written, but I saw your name and read your story, and now I know I can still choose who I become. Marilyn wept when she read that one. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten, that even the smallest voice, when brave enough to speak, could echo in places she'd never see. Ingrid, too, was declining. The cancer had reached her bones, and pain had begun to take her strength, but she refused to leave the hospital. "This is my home now," she said, "and you're my family." Marilyn and Ruby stayed with her during her harder days, reading to her, brushing her hair, and keeping her spirits lifted. Ingrid, in turn, gifted Marilyn something she'd kept hidden for years, a photograph of her and her partner, a woman named Celeste, taken at a lake in Vermont. It was faded, but the love between them was unmistakable. "We weren't allowed to be public," Ingrid had said, "but now, at least one person knows we existed." Marilyn framed the photo and kept it on her windowsill. "These walls will forget me," Ingrid said one night, staring up at the ceiling. "No, they won't," Marilyn whispered, "because I won't let them." The next few days were tender and heavy. Ingrid slipped in and out of sleep, and one morning, quietly, she was gone. A nurse found her hand resting on her chest, her face calm. There was no drama, no final gasp, just a soft departure from a lifelong lived in silence. They held a small vigil in her honor. Marilyn, Ruby, Daniel, and a few staff members. Marilyn read a passage from one of Ingrid's journals, and Ruby played a soft tune on her phone, one Ingrid had always requested during their evenings together. After the ceremony, Daniel pulled Marilyn aside. "I didn't know her well, but I wish I had. She taught me that love never needs to shout to be real," Marilyn replied. "It just needs to be brave." That night, Marilyn added a new chapter to her memoir. She titled it, "The Woman Who Lived in Whispers." It was a tribute to Ingrid, and to all the quiet souls the world had overlooked. As the days passed, Marilyn knew time was becoming more precious. She didn't fear it anymore, not even the end. She had said the things she once kept buried. She had made peace with the son she thought she'd lost. She had created something lasting, and most of all, she had been loved not in grandeur, but in moments, in gestures, in companionship that needed no explanation. One afternoon, as Ruby adjusted her fore and fluffed her pillows, Marilyn looked up and said, "I want to go home." Ruby paused. "Your apartment?" "No," Marilyn smiled. "The cottage one last time." It wasn't easy. The doctors were hesitant, but after weeks of planning, Benjamin coordinated hospice care, and Eliza offered to house her for as long as she needed. Daniel arranged for transport, and Ruby took a week off to accompany her. Even the hospital administrators offered their blessings. And so, with the spring air warming the earth, Marilyn Cooper left the hospital not as a patient, but as a woman returning to where her love had lived. She looked out the window of the van as trees passed by, birds soaring over fields, and 1,000 tiny flowers blooming by the roadside. Each mile was a goodbye, and also a welcome. She wasn't afraid, because she was going not to die, but to rest, to be in the place where her soul had always felt most seen. To be home. The drive to the cottage was long but serene. Marilyn sat reclined in the back seat of the specialized van, her legs covered with a soft quilt Ruby had folded over her. Eliza was waiting at the Vermont property with everything prepared, equipment in the guest room, fresh linens, and even a window-facing reading nook where Marilyn could rest and still see the lake shimmer during the late afternoons. Daniel had taken time off from work to assist with the move and arranged for private nurses to support her transition to home-based care. For the first time in years, he didn't check his phone. He sat quietly beside her, holding her hand as the green hills and long roads passed outside. Marilyn had barely spoken during the trip, conserving her strength. The fatigue had grown stronger in recent days, and while her spirits still sparked in conversation, her body no longer kept pace. Yet as the van turned onto the gravel path that led to the cottage, she opened her eyes wide and smiled. Asterisk, there it is, she whispered. Asterisk nestled between towering pines and a still lake. The cottage looked almost exactly as she remembered it. The white paint had faded, the roof shingles were weathered, and the garden was slightly overgrown, but it was perfect. It wasn't a place of death or decline. It was a place of memory, of love that never needed words, of silence that spoke, louder than any crowd. James had built the porch with his bare hands, laid every tile by himself, and carved their initials into the old oak tree out back. Asterisk, when they lifted Marilyn out of the van and carried her gently into the cottage, she sighed, her fingers brushing along the old wooden doorframe. She had returned not as a patient, not as someone seeking rescue, but as someone seeking closure. Ruby helped her settle into the guest bed near the wide window facing the lake. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the trees, like a familiar lullaby. Asterisk, I feel like I've come full circle, Marilyn murmured. Asterisk, you have, Ruby said, sitting beside her, and you brought all of us with you. Asterisk, in the days that followed, the cottage became alive again, not in noise or frenzy, but in presence. Eliza stayed in the upstairs room, bringing fresh soup and reading aloud every evening. Daniel took long walks with Ruby along the lake and even fixed the creaky porch steps, just as James once had. He found a quiet sort of healing in each nail he hammered, in each piece of wood he set. It was as if tending to the house was his way of apologizing for the years he couldn't tend to his mother. Asterisk, one afternoon, Marilyn asked Daniel to bring her James's old box, the one filled with his sketches, letters, and journals. Asterisk, I want you to know who he really was, she said. Asterisk, Daniel sat beside her on the bed and opened the box. Together, they looked through drawings of the cottage, as James had once imagined it, notes he had written on his commute, even an unsent letter he had begun drafting to Daniel on the day of his college graduation. In it, James had written, Son, I'm proud of you, not for your degree, but for how you treat the people who don't expect you to notice them. That's the mark of a good man, and I hope someday you see your mother not as the person who raised you, but as the lighthouse that kept you from drifting. Asterisk, Daniel read the letter aloud, his voice cracking halfway through. Marilyn didn't speak. She just reached for his hand and held it tightly. Asterisk, that night, he sat with her in the quiet hours when everyone else had gone to sleep. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting shadows on the ceiling. Outside, the moonlight danced across the lake. He turned to her and whispered, I wish I had found my way back sooner. Asterisk, Marilyn's voice was barely above a breath. You found your way. That's what matters. Asterisk, the next morning, she woke later than usual. Her breathing had grown more shallow, and the nurse quietly told Ruby and Daniel that her vitals were weakening. They all knew what it meant. No alarms, no fear, just the gentle reality that time was coming full circle. Marilyn asked to be taken to the porch, wrapped in her shawl. Carried gently by Daniel and Ruby, she sat in her favorite rocking chair, looking out over the water as morning mist lifted from the surface. Asterisk, I used to sit here for hours with James, she said. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, just listened to the world. Asterisk, Eliza brought a cup of warm tea, and Ruby sat on the porch steps. Daniel sat at her feet, his back against the post. Asterisk, I don't want a funeral, Marilyn said softly. I want a celebration, a small one here, nothing fancy, just the people who saw me. You'll have it, Ruby whispered. I want my ashes scattered in the garden, she added, where James planted the lilacs. They always bloom in April. Asterisk, no one argued. No one tried to talk about miracles or hope for more time. It wasn't despair they felt. It was reverence for her strength, for her honesty, for the way she had taken her story and rewritten it on her own terms. Asterisk, that evening, Marilyn asked Daniel to read her the last entry she had written in her memoir. He sat beside her and opened the notebook. The words were shaky but legible. Asterisk, we spend our lives waiting to be chosen, to be seen, to be loved the way we love others. And sometimes that waiting breaks us. But if we choose to stop waiting and start living, something changes. We begin to see that the life we thought we were missing is already here in kindness, in courage, in quiet rebellion. I was left, but I did not stay behind. I was forgotten, but I remembered myself, and that is enough. That is everything. He closed the notebook, his hands trembling. Marilyn looked at him and whispered, Now, you read the rest. Asterisk, what rest? He asked. Asterisk, she gave a tired smile. Your page is your story. Write it better than I did. And then she closed her eyes. She didn't pass that night, nor the next. Asterisk, she lingered gently, slowly, like the final verse of a song you don't want to end. Asterisk, on the third morning, with the scent of early lilacs blooming outside and the sound of birds singing in the branches, Marilyn Cooper took her last breath. Asterisk, no pain, no struggle, just stillness, as if the wind had carried her. Asterisk, Daniel held her hand until it went cold. Ruby sat beside her, tears silent and slow. Eliza stood behind them, one hand over her heart. Asterisk, they didn't cry out, they didn't panic, they simply let her go. A week later, under soft April skies, they gathered in the garden just as she asked. No black suits, no hymns, just stories. Asterisk. Eliza read a letter Marilyn had written in advance. A goodbye to each of them. Asterisk, to Ruby. You taught me that family isn't blood, it's loyalty. Keep healing others. You've already healed me. Asterisk, to Eliza. You are my hope, my legacy. Dream big, rest when needed, and always write your own story. Asterisk, to Daniel. You were my greatest heartbreak and my greatest miracle. Thank you for coming home before it was too late. Now go make it mean something. Asterisk, they scattered her ashes under the lilac bush James had planted all those years ago. The scent filled the air, sweet and gentle. Daniel placed the dove Eliza had once crocheted at the base of the plant, tucked gently in the soil beside her. Asterisk, later, Ruby officially opened the first year of the Marilyn Cooper Compassionate Nursing Scholarship. Elisa created a small library at the cottage in Marilyn's name, filled with memoirs, journals, and donated books. Daniel founded the Cooper Initiative in his company, focusing on mentorship and care for overlooked communities. But more than the structures, more than the awards or names carved into plaques, it was the way they spoke of her that lived on. Asterisk, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a woman who had reclaimed herself, a woman who had turned silence into strength. Who had been forgotten and still chose to forgive, who had been left-handed, chose to stay loving. Asterisk, and in the quiet space where her chair once rocked, the wind whispered softly across the porch, as if saying, she mattered, she always had. Asterisk,